Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Pakulski. We always frame this podcast around living your greatest life in your greatest body. And if you want to truly live your greatest life, understanding epigenetics is an extremely important topic. So for the last 20 years, we've been focused on understanding the human genome, which is trying to decode our genetics. And we've done that, and we're absolutely able to do that. But the new science is looking into genetic expression, which is basically how our environment determines what genes are turned on and turned off. And this conversation is with a gentleman named Dr. Tom Stubbs. He's got a business out of the UK called Chronomics. That is the first company that I'm aware of that is doing an epigenetic analysis. So epigenetics, so you guys have a better understanding, is effectively how your body is constantly taking inventory to the environment around you and expressing certain genes to make you better suited and adapted to the environment around you. So if I'm exposed to the sun all the time over, potentially many years, my body will actually adapt to that. And if I'm exposed to pollutants over time, my body could actually adapt to that. If I'm exposed to high amounts of visceral fat, my body will adapt to that. And there's a lot of things, many things beyond those, that your body will begin to adapt to. And those adaptations could be positive or they could be negative. And the fact that we have the ability to control these with environmental exposures is a hugely promising thing, because a lot of us make excuses around genetics or have beliefs around genetics and why we can't do things. I like to frame this conversation around growth mindset versus fixed mindset. If you're someone with a fixed mindset in life, you believe your life is predetermined, you believe your genetics are predetermined, you can't change it. A growth mindset, we know now that epigenetics control our ability to express certain genes. So there's a lot of very particular things that can positively impact our genetic expression. So if you're someone making excuses around genetics, or if you have unconscious beliefs around why someone in your past or your parents had certain predispositions and therefore you will too, you are in for an amazing surprise in today's conversation with Dr. Tom Stubbs. I've also talked about this stuff at length with Dr. Anthony J., who is a previous podcast guest. It's an incredibly interesting topic, and there's a very few things that I know of that have a very positive impact in the way our body expresses our genes. So you guys are going to love this conversation with Dr. Tom Stubbs. We get into things like what are epigenetic marks, what are the main things they're looking for, how they work, and most importantly, where the science is taking us and what we're going to be able to control in the future. It's a very easy to understand conversation. It doesn't get very sciencey most of the time, so I'm sure you guys are going to love it, but I highly suggest you listen to the end, because we get into some really cool action items as to what we should be doing now to really start to live our greatest life. So whether or not you have a belief around the current person you are or the current genetic predisposition you have, you can absolutely change it and take it into your own hands. I hope you guys are having an amazing day, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Tom Stubbs. So we've had quite a few experts on to discuss genetics, particularly Dr. Anthony J., who's absolutely brilliant researcher at the Mayo Clinic, and he's kind of been my go-to guy when it comes to starting to at least begin to stick my big toe into this area of epigenetics. And it seems like, at least from my perspective, it's a very new science, and there's not very many people out there kind of explaining what that is, like what exactly is happening. And I'd love for you to just quickly give us a description as to how what epigenetics are and how those things come to play as far as their impact on our genetic expression.
Yeah, absolutely. So your genetics is your DNA code that's split across your chromosomes. And in humans, we have around about just over 3 billion letters, if you like. And like other animals and other types of life, we have 4 letters in our DNA code. So A, C, G, and T. And that 3 billion letters has to get compacted, and if you like, managed and handled in our cells, so that our cells can express the genes they need to express and function in the ways that we need them to function in order for us to be alive and living happily. And the way that DNA is controlled or regulated, or the way it's packaged is controlled by epigenetics. And epigenetics is kind of, if you like, a catch-all term for lots of different things happening. So there are proteins that the DNA gets wrapped around called histones. There's also chemical tags on DNA, like DNA methylation. And then there's the expression of genes itself to make RNA. There's specific types of RNA that are also involved in epigenetic regulation. So there's lots of different ways that epigenetics manifests itself, with the primary purpose being to enable one cell to become many different types of cells.
Very, very fascinating. So I'd love to dive into each of those. So I'm sure a lot of us have heard the term DNA methylation. Some may have heard about histones, and most have heard about RNA and different types of gene expression. But I'd love to begin to kind of unravel what those are in any particular order. I mean, so everybody talks about taking extra methylation support. I'd love to know what exactly that is and what the implications are.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, like you say, there's a lot of people interested in methylation. And when that's talked about, for instance, within the biohacker community or other communities, tends to be referring to the metabolic pathways associated with methylation. So, for instance, the generation of S-adenosylmethionine or something like that. So cofactors for the addition of methylation. But actually, methylation is used in lots of different ways. So DNA methylation, as the name suggests, is the addition of a methyl group. But also within histones themselves, these proteins that DNA gets wrapped around, they have little tails on them, tails of proteins, if you like. And different amino acids can also get methylation added. So this methylation process is quite complicated. It's not just kind of, okay, you've got this level of S-adenosylmethionine or S-adenosylhomocysteine homocysteine or whatever it might be. It's actually more intricate than that, and kind of where on your genome is this methylation being added. So in the case of DNA methylation, for instance, there are tens of millions of positions in the genome where methylation can be placed, and the placing of that methylation is important for defining, for instance, the cell type, and is also associated with aging. So as you age, the methylation landscape, so your DNA methylation, changes with time. And what's been shown more recently by us and others is that those changes over time are predictive of not just chronological age, but also biological age. So how healthy you look relative to how old you are.
Mm-hmm. How are you guys beginning to study this stuff? So obviously, if you've got all of these infinite number of potential places for these methylation marks to occur, how do you begin to look at creating some type of algorithm to create predictive behaviors?
Yeah, great question. So I guess just if we're talking specifically about DNA methylation, so this is one specific epigenetic mark and can be thought of, I guess, as the archetypal epigenetic modification. And whereas in the case of the Human Genome Project that completed back in 2001, the first whole epigenome was completed in 2006. So there's kind of a five-year lag there. I think one thing that's important to say is that methylation, at least in mammals, so in humans, for instance, typically only or predominantly occurs on the letter C, so cytosine, out of the 4 letters in your DNA. And it typically only happens when that cytosine is followed by a guanine, so what we call a CG dinucleotide. And so that limits the number of positions from the 3 billion or more that we said you had in your DNA down to the 20 to 30 million CG dinucleotides in the genome. But then the way that we assess this in Chronomics and other people assess this, there's 2 predominant technologies. One is what we call methyl arrays or array technology. And with array technology, this is similar to what 23andMe use, Ancestry use, companies like this. And this technology allows you to look at a limited sample of the genetic, or in the case of epigenetics, epigenetic positions that are of interest. On the other side is the more recent and more accurate technology of next generation sequencing. And here, rather than just taking little pieces of DNA and sticking them to another piece of DNA, you actually read along the DNA and get to see every single letter, which improves accuracy because you can look at multiple copies of that DNA, and also enables you to not just look at a small sample of positions, but actually look at every position in the genome. So that's how we assess epigenetics using next generation sequencing technology.
So what type of things are you able to determine by looking at these methylation expressions? So obviously there's an infinite number of possibilities, but what does it allow you to predict?
Yeah, great question. So epigenetics really allows you to see how lifestyle and environment are impacting your health in a way that assessing genetics can't, because genetics is fixed from birth. In our case, we as a company specifically test saliva samples. So it's a simple kind of at-home saliva test kit that then we sample with next generation sequencing to then derive this data that we build indicators to enable people to make and track positive changes to their health. In terms of these indicators, we look at things such as biological age, as we've mentioned. And biological age, if we take that as an example, is affected by things like diet, exercise, and stress. And also different types of disease states. And then additional indicators that we look at include things like smoke exposure. So not just whether you're a smoker or not, but even if you're not a smoker, how much is exposure to secondhand smoke affecting your health? And it's this type of information that enables people to understand which aspects of their lifestyle and environment should they be potentially working on to live a healthier life.
Super interesting. So you could ultimately look at these and say, hey, man, you've got tremendous amounts of smoke exposure. You've got a tremendous amount of exposure to pollutants. You've got a tremendous amount of exposure to stress, and differentiate between the environmental impacts.
Exactly. So the great thing is of being able to look at something like DNA methylation using the technology that we use is because you have such a large number of positions that you can derive these indicators from, you're able to build very specific signatures for different chemicals, if you like. So you can start to pin down what aspects of people's health, people's environment and lifestyle are affecting health. And I think what's really exciting from our perspective is that there is so much more that we will be able to tell in the future as well.
Do different people have different levels of susceptibility to, is that influenced by epigenetics as well, or is that mostly a genetic consideration?
Yeah, great question. So different people for sure have different genetic predispositions to things. And these can be, things that you don't even think of as risk factors, if you like, such as eye color.
I understand that the genetic differences, like everyone's obviously got their genetic expression and their SNPs, et cetera, but how do people have different predisposition to epigenetic expression? So if two people are exposed to the same type of or environmental factors for, let's say, a few years, could they respond differently as far as the way these epigenetic marks occur on their histones?
Yeah, so if we, I guess, stick with talking about methylation marks on DNA, if you took two identical people and they had the exact same environment and lifestyle, which even for identical twins doesn't happen,
right?
You would expect the epigenetic changes to be the same. But even as we know for identical twins, so people that share the same genetic material, even from within the womb, so even before they're born, their environment and their lifestyle is different. Sure. And I guess one example of this is fingertips. So they have different fingertip patterns. And obviously over time, those things extrapolate. And that's why you can have identical twins where one twin may develop cancer early in their life and the other twin may live a long and healthy life.
in your best estimate, this may be a completely impossible question to answer, but in your best estimate, what would have a greater impact on someone's quality of life, someone's length of their life, their SNPs, so their predisposition to certain genetic variants, or epigenetic expression?
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting question, and it kind of...
I could be completely wrong with the way I'm asking it, but maybe you could clarify so I can understand.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the first thing to say is that this depends on what those genetic variants are. So obviously there are some genetic mutations that if people have, they are incredibly strongly associated with adverse health outcomes or diseases.
Sure.
But for the vast majority of things that affect us today, they're caused by age-related or chronic diseases. And these are things such as cancer, heart disease, and other types of age-related ailments. I guess type 2 diabetes also, with kind of obesity on the rise. And when you actually strip back to how much of that risk is due to genetic differences, so somebody potentially being more predisposed to suffering from cancer because they maybe have mutations in certain DNA repair proteins, or whether it be some sort of metabolic differences that then mean that somebody is potentially slightly more prone to obesity. What we find for cancer, obesity, heart disease, all these sorts of diseases, is that actually the environment and lifestyle component, the epigenetic component, is far, far greater than any minute genetic difference between people. And I think this is a really important point for people to understand, is that genetics is incredibly powerful and giving us a lot of really useful information in the case of pharmacogenomics and things like this. But people shouldn't feel that their lives are predetermined, their health outcomes are predetermined. There's so much of the things that people suffer from today that are solely due to environment and lifestyle factors. So, for instance, if you take, I guess, the archetypal genetic cancer predisposition would be, for instance, BRCA mutations in breast cancer. And I guess there have been famous examples of where people have undergone, for instance, mastectomies in the case of Angelina Jolie. But even in those instances where they're used as the archetypal genetic predisposition case, you have incidences of cancer in people with those mutations of only 40%, which means 60% of those people, even with those mutations, won't succumb to breast cancer. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have things like salivary gland cancer, where genetic predisposition has less than 1% impact on the chance of whether you're going to develop that type of cancer or not.
Is this methylation expression exclusively a negative thing? Meaning, if I'm exposed to a stress, I may get some type of DNA mark or methylation mark or mark on my histones, or is there positive ones as well? So from the sounds of it, from what I've heard, it sounds like these things are only a result of negative behavior. So you mentioned, diet or stress or smoke or pollutants. So all these things have are repercussions of negative environmental exposures. Yeah,
great. Another great question. So I think the first thing to say is that methylation, DNA methylation, is not something happening and then a methylation mark gets added. So for instance, in the case of aging, there are some positions in the genome that gain methylation with age, and there are other positions that lose methylation with age. And that's also true for these environmental or lifestyle perturbations, if you like. So some positions will gain methylation and others will lose methylation. And it's then defining models that can pick up those signatures that enable you to determine how that environment, lifestyle factor, or age is impacting that person. So I guess that's one aspect. The other aspect is to say that, yeah, it's definitely true that improvements to health improve your epigenetic profile. So if we take the smoke exposure example, for instance, if you have been somebody that's exposed to a lot of smoke and that's impacted your epigenetic score, if you like, or epigenetic indicator, if you reduce that exposure, you will improve your epigenetic score for smoke exposure. So it's not a case of because this thing has happened, you now can't bring it back. So I guess in response to your questions, if whether due to diet or exercise or smoking, your epigenetic profile is changed, it's possible to bring it back.
Well, that's exactly where I wanted to go next. I'm very curious as to, is it just a matter of like improving overall health markers, like improving sleep, decreasing stress, improving exercise, like typical things that people hear? Or are there actually things that we know are better at improving our epigenetic expression?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think one important thing here is that there's a huge number of things that we know that are good for people, but which ones are going to be most meaningful for which people are impossible to just get from looking at them. And in order to get that level of detail, you need to understand how those different components are coming together to affect that person's health. And in the case of, are there certain things that are going to improve your epigenetic score for different types of things? It's definitely going to be the case that some things will improve it more than others. But that's one thing that as a company, again, we're really excited by, is the possibility of actually, if you like, benchmarking wellness, things that people introduce into their lives to improve their health, and seeing which ones are actually making the most improvement and which ones aren't actually doing a huge amount at an epigenetic level.
Super cool. Hey, everybody, I interrupt this podcast to tell you about something I'd like for everyone to try. If you drink coffee, what I do every single morning is something that I've called Intelligence Coffee. And it's a simple mix of 600 milligrams of alpha GPC, 5 grams of MCT, 3 grams of lion's mane, and at your discretion, anywhere from 10 to 15 grams of collagen protein. I add that in, I blend it up, and it literally tastes incredible and lights up my brain for the entire day. And I really feel like it's allowed me to improve my cognitive function, improve my ability to learn. Lion's mane mushroom has an incredible ability to improve nerve growth factor. So again, those ingredients, alpha GPC, MCT, collagen, lion's mane. You guys are going to love Intelligence Coffee, something that I've been using for probably about 12 months. And I try to use it at least twice a day. And sometimes I'll even mix it with a decaf coffee at night, because other than the caffeine in the coffee, nothing else is stimulating in there. You can take alpha GPC, you can take lion's mane and go to bed and not have any real negative effects. And in fact, it may actually improve your sleep. So I highly suggest you guys add Intelligence Coffee into your daily routine. And if you're not someone who's tried lion's mane before, Four Sigmatic is one of our sponsors, and they would love to hook you guys up with a discount of 15% if you head over to foursigmatic.com and use the code MUSCLE. Foursigmatic.com, use the code MUSCLE. You can get 15% off. And a huge shout out to Four Sigmatic, who continues to support this podcast, continues to help us get the best guests in the world so you guys can continue to grow your life. So if you enjoy the podcast, guys, I appreciate you giving Four Sigmatic a shout out. Give them a follow on Instagram. Awesome group of people over there. We're actually looking forward to having their founder on the podcast sometime soon, because he's got a really interesting story, and I think it's super interesting to hear. And plus, I'm fascinated with mushrooms. Mushrooms may be my greatest fascination right now. All types of mushrooms, and not just lion's mane. Lion's mane is the one I use daily, twice a day. I use reishi every day as well. Cordyceps is fascinating, and there's also some other things called turkey tail, which I use quite often as well. And then you guys know the idea of psilocybin mushrooms is becoming huge right now, and I'm really doing a lot of studying around that topic, which to be determined, and my opinions will come soon. But I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the show with Dr. Tom Stubbs. One thing I'm like to ask is, it seems likely that different cells from different parts of the body may have different marks. Is that the truth? And is there any implications of only looking at saliva cells in the mouth?
Yeah, great question again. So absolutely. So as we said at the start, like epigenetics is the reason that starting from one cell, we can have all these specialized and differentiated cell types in our bodies. And in order for you to have a liver cell expressing what needs to be expressed for the liver, and a skin cell doing what it needs to do in order to function as a skin cell, you need different proteins to be expressed, and therefore you need that DNA to be regulated and controlled or patterned differently in order to fulfill that function. And so it's definitely true that different cell types have different epigenetic profiles. In terms of saliva and why we choose this sample, we choose this sample for a number of reasons, but primarily because of its proximity to the brain, so giving information about mental health in the future. And then also because within saliva, you also have blood cells. So people often think that you can only get access to your blood from blood, but actually in your mouth there is white blood cells as well. So it gives you access to not just your salivary, kind of what's happening in your mouth, but also more systemically from your blood system. That being said, I think the other thing to bear in mind is that with what we do at Chronomics, we're not attempting to define and understand the mechanism for why obesity is causing epigenetic changes in your liver or your adipocytes or whatever it might be that is causing the phenotype or the disease state, but rather we're trying to provide biomarkers to enable people to take action. And that's what we're doing from these secondary site information, so from saliva.
Super interesting. Now, one thing I'm very interested in is, obviously, if you're taking effectively, you said the full genome or very close to it, you've got a couple 100 million ultimately SNPs. How do we know which ones to look at? Are you guys sequencing? I think you said you're sequencing the entire genome when you do this, right?
So we offer two services. We have one whole genome sequencing service, but that's a genetic service, so looking at fixed DNA. And there we look at all 3 billion letters in the DNA. We also, from the epigenetic side of things, we look at 500 million positions, and within that is contained 5 million CG positions, so the positions that have methylation, as we discussed earlier.
Right.
And we've selected those positions out of the possible 20 to 30 million positions because these are the regions that are typically most variable and most altered, if you like, in different cell types and under different conditions. So they're the areas where, if you like, the epigenetic action is. The vast majority of the epigenome is there to repress. So I guess one thing we haven't talked about is that in your DNA, all of us have viral elements that have been in our DNA for generations and generations and generations. And these pieces of virus that aren't even really proper viruses anymore need to get repressed or need to not be expressed within our cells for the vast majority of the time. And so DNA methylation is responsible for repressing those things. And we talked about different cell types having different methylation profiles. That's true for these active regions, if you like, but for these viral repressing regions, they're very constant across cell types because in all cell types, in the majority of the cases, you do not want these things expressed. So we've chosen to focus on the most active epigenetic regions of the genome.
So obviously that would be a tremendous amount of data for an untrained person to come and look at. You're looking at 5 million areas. How would you recommend the average person who comes to Chronomics begin to dissect where they should start looking for their exposures?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've actually spent a lot of time with customers and with partners working on this to try and make this process as simple, easy, and intuitive for people as possible. And so what we've done is break down each of the epigenetic indicators and the information surrounding that and information to enable people to understand into bite-sized pieces that then people can look at. So people can look at, okay, their smoke exposure and understand where that's come from, how that came about, what they can do about it, what factors in their environment are affecting that score, and then go and work on how to improve it. And we do that for all the different epigenetic indicators that we look at.
So all that would be included for someone who were to sign up for your service? Like they get exposure to all of them? Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's something that's hugely important, is making this information not just available to a trained scientist, but actually making it available so that everyone can understand and benefit from it.
Very cool. How long have you guys been doing this?
So as a company, we've been doing this for just over a year. And I guess as scientists within the company, we've been working in the field of epigenetics for cumulatively almost getting on for 10 years now.
As you begin to accumulate a larger and larger number of people, are there any interesting new discoveries you're making to, by seeing, simply more numbers and identifying more variants?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that's really exciting from our perspective is the wealth of environment and lifestyle factors relating to epigenetics that just haven't been looked at until now, because most studies haven't been done in the context of ordinary people like ourselves going about their lives. And so there's a huge amount yet to be discovered. And one or two areas that we're particularly interested are, one, kind of, as you mentioned, drilling down to environmental exposures such as air pollution and things like that. And then two, also drilling into really early stages of mental health and metabolic health related issues. But stay tuned for what happens there.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys are digging in deep. Now, is that a big part of your business right now? Obviously, developing a business is a whole new venture in and of itself, but are you guys still keeping pretty active with the research, and you building teams around that? Or is most of the business now, or most of your time now, committed to just getting more people into the funnel?
No, so I think we're in a really exciting place where we are creating this, as you say, this commercial entity. But at the same time, we, as a company, aren't losing sight of our duty to carry on doing the research that's only been made possible by creating the company. And as a company founded by scientists, that's what really excites us, is not what we can offer people today, but the potential of what we can offer people in the future.
Super exciting. This is definitely one of the most interesting areas of science right now, right? So if I can actually have some quantifiable measure as to what my body looks like on the inside and how I can begin to change it, it's hugely interesting to me. Now, is this relatively cost prohibitive at this point? Like if I was to do this, I'd love to have some opportunity to be able to do it, once every 6 months, once every 12 months, to see if the environmental interventions I've been partaking in are actually having some impact. So what is the relative cost of this? And is it something that's reasonable for someone to say do every year for the next 10 years?
Yeah, great question. So this is something that we would obviously think everyone should be doing, and we would love it if that were to be the case. In terms of the pricing, so with your Chronomics testing, you get the test results itself, but then you also get access to our suite of health coaches, improvements, and also access to scientists who really understand what's going on in the data to answer any questions that people have. And in terms of the customers we have to date, as you rightly said, like, most people are wanting to do these tests on a 12-monthly, so yearly basis, as part of a health check-in, if you like. In terms of the price point, the test is currently on the market today at £700 a year or £70 a month. And as part of the podcast, I've been informed by our sales team that we're able to offer an exclusive discount. So I guess there'll be a link to follow.
Oh, wonderful. We'll definitely link to that in the show notes. I know I'm going to jump on it. I mean, for me, like taking a guess at what my negative environmental impacts are is one thing, but actually having some quantifiable marks, no pun intended, would be incredibly valuable. And, I'm extremely excited to start digging into the platform, Tom.
Awesome. That's great to hear, Ben. And yeah, that is, one thing that really drives us is being able to put numbers on something that was previously unseen. So as a company, our vision or mission statement, if you like, is to improve human health by making the unseen actionable.
How much data are you guys into right now? I'd be very curious to see, because ultimately people can make assumptions or hypotheses about potential implications of, hey, if you take this supplement, or hey, if you do this exercise intervention, you're gonna extend your life, you're gonna increase your health. Is there a tremendous amount of research going into this stuff right now to see, like, because to me, if I take 30 days of vitamin C and I check my epigenetics again, I would presume that I should see some positive changes or some positive implications, or some negative, seeing which direction to go. Is this science that accurate now, where, in a short period of time, as short as 30 or 90 days, I could actually see some measurable changes?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of, I guess, wellness interventions, so whether that be taking, as you say, vitamin supplements or going on different exercise regimes, the data linking that to improvements is relatively weak. And I think that's where we as Chronomics are really excited to get involved and be able to, if you like, provide some scientific rigor at an epigenetic level for those things. So that's definitely something that we're working with our partners to start to do at the moment.
And I know we briefly brought this up, but I'd love for you to just finish up with talking a little bit about some of the interventions that you guys have seen as being having the greatest impact on actually improving the state of the epigenetic expression.
Yeah, I think this, again, is a great question. And what makes this a hard one to answer is, I guess, goes back to what we were saying partway through the conversation about the fact that this information is personalized. And each of us are living different lives. And so what each of us needs to work on will be different for each and every person.
Okay.
So it's a kind of, refrain, I guess, from giving generalist insights. Apologies for that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And like I said, I've snooped around your website a little bit, and you guys do a pretty good job of getting pretty explicit with, like, hey, you have too much of this. Go pay attention to that. Like, where's it coming from? Identify it. And then I don't know how much guidance you're giving on intervention strategies, but you're certainly doing a pretty good job on, or at least from what I saw, on identifying what those greatest hurdles are, I guess, for most people.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's great to hear. And yeah, that is what we're working to do, is provide people with personalized information that they can then, not everyone, I guess, has the time to lead or wants to lead the perfect lifestyle, but finding out what are those things that people should be focused on to improve their health for the long term is what really excites us.
Have you guys seen any definitive markers that are kind of indicative of peril or of illness or of, like, hey, you're going to die kind of stuff? Because, we've got people talking about telomeres, and I'm curious how that kind of integrates with what you guys are doing. And if there's any, like, you're looking at someone's DNA and all of a sudden you've got, oh gosh, they've got a mark here. That means they've got, this much time to live. I'm sure that's a little extreme example, but is there any specifics you guys have identified as being indicative of illness or disease or ultimately death?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an important point here, which is epigenetics has been used in clinics for a long time to, if you like, substratify, for instance, different tumor types. So to then define what sort of treatments people should have. In the case of other types of diseases, you've got things like heart attacks or strokes, where epigenetic positions have been associated with those diseases. Also mental health diseases. In the case of age, because you mentioned it, so you mentioned telomere length, which is obviously a way that people typically measure or try to measure biological age using blood samples, so leukocytes. And in comparison, epigenetic age prediction is much better correlated with age than telomere length. And what's, I guess, also been shown, which again you briefly mentioned, time to death. So in the case of epigenetics, there have been a number of studies that have shown you can predict time to death from epigenetic biological age, and that's all-cause mortality time to death. So obviously not including whether you're going to get hit by a bus or not, but whether that death may be from cardiac issues or cancer-related problems or whatever it might be, it's possible to predict from an epigenetic predictor. I think it's important to say, though, that as a company, from our perspective, it's all about personalization and being proactive with your health management, not timing when you're going to die.
Yeah, sure. But that's just such a subjective thing, right? Like this whole health industry is guiding people in every which direction. It's like, hey, you need to do this, you need to do that, but oh, don't do too much of that because that's going to hurt you too. And it's just this incredibly subjective space, and everyone's just confused and unsure what to do. I mean, that's really why I have the podcast, is trying to kind of demystify all the BS around health and what actually works and what doesn't, and realizing that what works for me doesn't work for you, and just ultimately trying to provide people valuable information so they can make intelligent decisions by themselves. And so if we can actually have something that quantifies, like, hey, you did this happened to your epigenetic expression, and actually be able to make some type of impact on that in a positive way, definitely seems like I think the most interesting area right now of in this whole health space. So, kudos to you guys for identifying that such a long time ago, and you guys are all such a young age. I'm fascinated and incredibly excited to see what you guys do in the next 2 to ultimately 20 years.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, no, it's great to hear that that was your rationale for starting the podcast. And when we speak to health coaches, particularly in the UK, they keep telling us, how happy or excited they are by the potential for Chronomics to, as you say, remove the guesswork from lots of these health and wellness type interventions that we don't actually have huge amounts of evidence for whether they will work or not, and for who they'll work for. So yeah, great to hear.
Yeah, and it seems like ultimately every company out there in the health space has some value in beginning to do some testing with you guys. I mean, I'm not sure if there's other companies out there doing what you do, like I say, but whether it be a supplement company or any company that is some health intervention strategy, would probably be in their best interest to collaborate with you guys or hire you guys to start reading the epigenetic profiles and actually quantifying the ability to make a change. That to me seems like maybe the most interesting, or the most beneficial long-term strategy to quantify changes. Like you look at so much scientific data right now and it's so subjective. Who was the person doing it? What did they test? What were the variables they didn't look at that could have impacted the results? And so many things that just lead to the subjectivity of the data that exists. And if we can ultimately verify and quantify the end result of these scientific studies with epigenetics, gosh, like, yes, please sign me up. Right. So I'm behind you, man. You guys keep pushing, and I'm going to send as many people as I can to you guys. And if I can open any doors to people that would help you, then I'm behind you. So well done, Tom. Good on you, man.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time, and have an amazing day.
Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pakulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.